Good morning. Why don't we go ahead and start? Javier Becerra, I'm the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus. This morning, we had a very full House of Democrats this week interested in learning a little bit more about where we go this week on the issue of Iraq and Syria, in going after the terrorists that we know as ISIL, and dealing with all the other issues that we have on our plate here in Washington, D.C. for the country, and that includes, of course, a budget. It includes the reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank. It includes any number of things that are important for us to deal with, not the least of which is trying to just continue to work with the president to help create the jobs that are putting millions of Americans back to work. I will touch on just a couple of points because we did run a little late. We had a very good conversation, lots of questions, lots of comments directed at Tony Blinken from the White House and the National Security Council, who gave us further amplification of some of the things that he has said in the past. It was not a classified setting, so it was all things that members had been told before in an unclassified setting. I will say that the more that I hear, the more it becomes clear that the president is correct. We must act, and we must act deliberately. We must act decisively in dealing with any threats to the American people and to our homeland, to those partners that we have in the region and abroad, to make sure that these threats don't come home in ways that could truly do us harm. And so I believe the president has set forth a course of action. Second, it's also becoming clear that the real test here is not to our will as Americans. It's a test of our alliance, whether it's NATO or whether the countries in the region most affected, whether it's the Arab League countries, whether it's a country like Turkey or Saudi Arabia, Jordan, or the Arab Emirates. You name those countries that are in that region that are going to suffer the most if we don't deal with this terrorism and the threat of insurgency that we see coming from this group called ISIL. And so more and more, I think it's becoming clear, and it should become clear to Americans, that it's not a test of our will as Americans. We're ready. And as the president said before, the one constant in this fight is America's leadership. And so I feel very clear-minded and firmly in my position is saying that America is ready to do what it must to protect its people and its homeland. I hope that the rest of the nations that would be impacted are prepared to do the same thing as well. And certainly that would include, first and foremost, the government of Iraq, which must step to the plate, because at some point the real question will be before us, the real battle, which is, do Iraqis wish to be Iraqis? Or do they wish to be Sunni, Shia, Kurd, and Christian? In which case, no amount of troops on the ground from any country can solve the problem of a disintegrating Iraq. And so for many of us, I believe the question is not if we have the will as Americans. That's been proven, and the president articulated that last week. It's whether the alliance that will be necessary to defeat these insurgency forces will be there, including with troops on the ground, if and when necessary, so that we can say that we all are going to work together as an alliance to defeat this threat, not just to Americans, not just democracy, but quite honestly to our civilization. And so having said that, I will now withhold and see if there are any questions. Otherwise, I'll move on to my next meeting. So what we do face today is not a vote to reauthorize or to authorize the use of military force in Iraq against ISIL. What we will have this week for us is an amendment that would be attached to the continuing resolution for the budget to keep our government operating. That amendment would call for what the president identified last week, which is resources to be able to recruit and train individuals that will be part of a force in Syria that will help take on ISIL in Syria. And so that amendment will come before us. We'll have an opportunity to debate it and vote. It just came out last night. Many members asked questions about the amendment, more specifically about the elements of that amendment. And my sense is that over the next several hours, as we get ready to start to debate that amendment, members will have more clarity. The administration, Tony Blinken, said that today that the White House is supportive of the amendment, and that we know that it is directed at the president's request of last week for the monies to recruit and train those forces. And so we'll see. I think a number of members want to take a close look at that amendment because it does deal specifically with where we will go when it comes to addressing the threat that is ISIL.
You said there were questions about elements of the amendment. What specifically?
People want to know how tailored, how specific it was, how broadly it would allow the president to act, where the money would go, what type of consultation there would be with Congress, whether this goes beyond what the president announced last week. So there were just mostly questions because while we've heard that the president made this request last week, and we knew that the Rules Committee would be discussing putting an amendment or some version of the president's request before us this week, members had not had a chance to read the language of the amendment. And so the amendment freshly printed is now available. Members will begin to read it. And I think the administration did make clear that having worked with the House and the Senate on the language, that they are supportive of that amendment.
When you vote for it?
I have to take a close look at it. If it's narrowly tailored to address what the president said, then I likely would support it. But again, I'm one of those who wants to make sure that this is very discreetly defined, because I do believe that you could easily start to have mission creep in much of this. And so I would like to make sure that it's clear what we will do. It's clear what those who we profess to be able to train will do. And it's going to be important to know that we're going to be kept abreast of how this proceeds, if indeed it is passed and does get implemented. Any other questions? Yeah.
Sorry if this was asked already, but there's obviously a push in your caucus for a broader authorization vote. Is there any talk of a promise, if we support this now, that there will be something when we come back and the lane's up? Is that a possibility?
None of that was ever asked, or certainly wasn't posed that way. But members will do what they feel they must do on this amendment, on this particular issue presented by the amendment with regard to resources to help recruit and train those to help fight ISIL within Syria. On the issue of whether there is an authorization to use military force with regard to ISIL, there was plenty of conversation and discussion about that. I believe most of the members who spoke, at least those who spoke, expressed a desire to have a vote on an authorization sooner than later. Some members would like to have that vote occur this week. Some members would like to make sure that we have one soon. And so I think you're going to see a lot of members expressing themselves as we see as things develop with regard to ISIL and how we'll approach it. The closer it becomes an intense and prolonged battle with ISIL, I think the more intensely you'll find the call within Congress to have an authorization to use military force vote.
Where do you stand on that?
I first believe that the president has the authority as the commander-in-chief under Article 2 of the Constitution to defend Americans and protect us. And so in the first instant, because we know that ISIL has killed Americans and would do more, I believe the president has the authority to do what he can to descend on that threat. And so I've supported the president, what he's done, and I supported what the president called for last week. The more it starts to verge towards a prolonged and intense action, as I mentioned, to the point of being called to war, then absolutely I'm one of those who believes that you must have a vote on an authorization to use military force. I don't believe that the 2001 authorization to use military force that was used to go after al-Qaeda and the Taliban is appropriate in this case. And the more we verge into something that would be considered war, the more I absolutely would expect that we would have a debate and a vote in Congress on whether to proceed.
Are there any concerns about arming Syrian moderates and that weapons could fall into the wrong hands? Is that brought up in cases?
Personally, I would always have that concern of arming anyone that isn't an American soldier. We see right now ISIL parading around in American military vehicles using American military equipment. We should always be concerned. At the same time, as the president, I believe, has said, and his administration has made clear, we need to have the folks on the ground tackle ISIL before they start asking others to stand up for them. And so if there are people who are ready to stand up and be trained and take on this militant insurgency called ISIL, I'm prepared to help train those individuals, so long as we can have a process which gives us a level of certainty about the vetting. I'm not interested in training human rights abusers to use American military weapons to fight ISIL and then find that the next day those weapons are being used against Americans. And so there's always that uncertainty and that danger that you train someone who ultimately turns a weapon on you. But right now, we have an imminent threat in ISIL, and we want to make sure we tackle that threat as best we can with forces that are from the area. So I would support it, but again, cautiously. That's why we have to read that amendment very closely that provides the resources for that recruitment and training, because we want to make sure that it gives us as much as possible the guarantees that we're not going to be just loosely spending the money, but we're going to be training folks who really have a high confidence that they will be acting the way we want them to act.
Once we do arm and train, is there a way to monitor them so that we would know if they're acting the way we want them to?
You know, those are all great questions, the questions we're asking as well. How are you recruiting? What are you training them to do? Who will lead them in the fight? Where will they be stationed? Where will they take on the fight? That's why we see the president sending some of our military personnel right now into the region, because you can't do it from thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C. And so the only way you're going to know whether they're well-trained, fighting the fight the way we'd like, winning or not, is if you've got someone watching and right there. And so that's very tough, and that's very dangerous. So none of this is in a hermetically sealed box of guarantees that what we do will translate into exactly the way we imagine it. We have to have all the confidence that we're going to have the checks and balances to make sure we do this right, or as best we can. And those are the reasons why these are very important and crucial votes. Any final questions? If not, thank you all very much.